The call came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray November Tuesday where everything feels slightly off before you even know why. I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly projections at my desk when my phone buzzed. It was my buddy Dave from the IT department down the hall. "Hey Marcus, you need to come look at something." Not on the phone. That was it, no explanation. Dave wasn't dramatic. In the 12 years I'd known him, he'd never once sent me a vague message like that. So I closed my laptop and walked down. He shut the door behind me before I even sat down. I'm a software engineer at a mid-sized financial technology company in Austin, Texas. I'd been there 11 years, worked my way up to lead architect, trusted by management, liked by my team. I had a good life. A house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a wife named Carolyn, who I had met at a college friend's wedding 14 years ago and married 2 years after that. Carolyn was beautiful in the way that made you feel lucky, just standing next to her. Not flashy, not loud. She had this quiet confidence that I fell in love with before I even realized I was falling. She worked in corporate communications at a real estate development firm downtown, which meant she spent her days around suits and money and people who were very good at presenting themselves. I never thought much of it. I trusted her completely. Dave pulled up his monitor and turned it toward me without saying a word. He managed the internal network security tools for our building. Not my department, but he occasionally looped me in when something touched our systems. On his screen was a log, a data transfer log. "This came across my alert board this morning," he said quietly. I almost dismissed it, but the destination address flagged something in the system. I leaned in and read. The filed transfers were coming from a device registered to our company's shared cloud account, a mobile device. The destination was an external server, not a client server, not an approved vendor, something I didn't recognize. "Whose device?" I asked. Dave hesitated. He looked at me like he was about to tell me someone had died. "It's registered under a guest access credential," he said. The credential was created 6 weeks ago by someone with admin access to the communications portal. I stared at him. "Who has admin access to the communications portal?" "Your department head, 3 senior engineers, and 1 external communications consultant who was brought on in September." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Who's the consultant?" Dave typed something and turned the screen again. A name I didn't know, a company I'd never heard of, a profile photo that had clearly been pulled from a stock image website. The consultant didn't exist. "I haven't reported this yet," Dave said carefully. "I wanted to talk to you first, because the access credentials were approved by your ID, your login." I sat back in the chair. "Dave, I never approved any external consultant," he nodded slowly. "I know. Your login was used at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night 3 weeks ago from a home IP address. I hadn't been up at 11:47 p.m. on any Thursday in recent memory. I went to bed by 10 most nights. I was boring that way. Carolyn used to tease me about it. I drove home that evening in a fog. I didn't say anything to Dave about what I was thinking, partly because I didn't want to think it, and partly because I was hoping I was wrong. I sat in the driveway for almost 10 minutes before going inside. Carolyn was in the kitchen making pasta. She kissed me on the cheek and asked about my day. I said it was fine. I watched her move around the kitchen and I felt sick. I didn't confront her that night. I needed to know more before I opened my mouth and accused my wife of something that could end our marriage. I needed facts. I needed to be sure. Over the next 4 days, I did what any person with a technical background and a shattering suspicion does. I paid attention. I noticed she was on her phone more than usual, but she'd always been on her phone for work. I noticed she came home 40 minutes later than normal on Wednesday and said she'd had a client dinner. I noticed she was quieter at night, more distracted. Or maybe I was just noticing these things for the first time because I was looking for them. That's the thing about suspicion. It makes you see everything differently, and you can never be sure afterward whether what you saw was real or just a story you built around your fear. On Thursday, I called the number listed on the fake consultant's company profile. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The voicemail was a generic automated response with no name. I hung up. That evening, I quietly checked the shared location on my phone. Carolyn and I had set it up 2 years ago after she'd gotten lost driving to a new client site and her battery died. Neither of us ever talked about it. It was just there. She was at a restaurant downtown. Not a client dinner location I recognized. I looked it up. It was a small Italian place on 5th Street. the kind with low lighting and a wine list that started at $60 a bottle. I got in my car. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I also don't regret it. I parked across the street and I sat there. And 20 minutes later, through the window of that restaurant, I saw my wife of 12 years laughing. Really laughing. The way she used to laugh with me when we were first dating. Her hand was on the table, and sitting across from her, leaning toward her with his whole body, was a man I recognized immediately. His name was Griffin Cole. He was the VP of Business Development at Carolyn's firm. I met him exactly twice. Once at a company holiday party 2 years ago, and once when I dropped off Carolyn's forgotten laptop at her office. He was the type of man who shook your hand while already looking past you. Tall, expensive watch, the kind of smile that was always slightly too ready. I drove home. I fed Biscuit. I sat on the couch in the dark until Carolyn came home at 10:15 and said she'd been at a work event and she was tired and was going to bed. I said goodnight. The next morning I called my brother, Nathan. He was the only person I trusted enough to say any of this out loud to. Nathan was 4 years older than me, steadier than me, and he had gone through his own ugly divorce 7 years earlier, so he understood in a way most people don't. "Don't do anything yet," he told me. "You have suspicion. You don't have proof of anything except that someone used your credentials and your wife was at dinner with a man from her office. Before you blow up your life, you need to know what you're actually dealing with." He was right. So I went back to Dave. I told Dave what I suspected. Not all of it, not the personal part, but enough. I told him I believed someone with access to my home network had used my credentials without my knowledge. I asked him to pull together everything he could about the fake consultant account. What files had been accessed, what had been transferred, where the data had gone. Dave worked quietly for 2 days. What he brought back to me was worse than I expected. The files that had been accessed and transferred were not random. They were targeted. Specifically, they were audit trail documents from a series of transactions that our fintech platform had processed for one of our largest real estate clients, a client whose transactions, as it turned out, had been flagged 18 months ago by our internal compliance system and quietly buried by someone above my pay grade. The kind of quiet burial that only happens when someone powerful decides a problem is more inconvenient than it is dangerous. The data that had been transferred out of our system was essentially evidence of financial irregularities that, if they reached the right or wrong hands, could be worth a significant amount of money to the right party. I went home that night and I looked at my wife differently, not with anger yet, with a kind of cold, awful sadness, the kind that comes when you realize a story you thought you understood has a completely different plot. I spent the weekend thinking. I walked Biscuit for 2 hours on Saturday morning, just walking and thinking. I thought about the years we had built together, the miscarriage we'd gotten through when we were 30, the cross-country move from Chicago to Austin that we'd done together with everything we owned in a rented truck. The night she'd sat with me when my mother was sick. I thought about all of it, and I thought about Griffin Cole leaning across that candlelit table, and I thought about my login credentials being used at 11:47 p.m. while I was asleep. By Sunday night, I had a plan. I am a software engineer. I build systems. I understand how data moves and where it leaves traces. So I used what I knew. I set up a secondary monitoring layer on our home network. Nothing that would be visible to a casual user, nothing that would alert anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. I waited. On Tuesday evening, Carolyn said she had some work emails to catch up on and went to the home office we shared. I stayed in the living room with the television on and watched the network activity in real time on my phone. At 9:23 p.m., a data query was made from her laptop to a cloud server, not our company server. A different one. The same one Dave had flagged. I closed my eyes. I sat very still. Biscuit put his head on my knee. I stood up, walked to the home office, and leaned in the doorway. Carolyn was at her desk, laptop open, phone face down beside her. "Hey," I said. She looked up. Her face was calm, slightly distracted, normal. "Hey," she said. "Almost done. You want anything from the kitchen?" "No," I said. "I'm good." I looked at her for a moment. She looked back at me. Then she turned back to her screen. I went back to the living room and I sat there and I made myself think clearly, because the version of me that wanted to walk back into that office and demand answers right then was not the version of me that was going to handle this correctly. I worked too hard and too carefully to let emotion ruin what I needed to do. The next morning I called a lawyer. I had a consultation scheduled by noon. Her name was Patricia Ellison. She was a former federal prosecutor who had moved into private practice 10 years earlier. and whose firm handled both family law and white-collar financial cases, which, as it turned out, made her uniquely qualified for what I was about to describe. I laid everything out for her. The credentials, the file transfers, the data, Griffin Cole, the restaurant, the network activity from Carolyn's laptop. I told her I didn't know yet whether my wife understood what she was involved in or whether she was a willing participant. I told her I needed to know what my exposure was if this became a legal matter, and I needed to know what my options were. Patricia listened to everything without interrupting. Then she asked me one question. Do you want to save your marriage, or do you want to know the truth? I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I want the truth, I said, and then I'll figure out the rest. She told me the financial irregularities I described, if documented properly, likely constituted securities fraud. The data exfiltration from our company's systems was potentially a federal offense. Whoever was behind this, whether it was Griffin Cole using Carolyn as a vector or something else entirely, was playing in territory that could land people in prison. She advised me not to confront Carolyn yet. She said we needed to get ahead of this in the right order. Document, protect, then act. I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly that. I worked with Dave quietly off the books, building a clean record of everything. I worked with Patricia to understand exactly what documentation would matter and what wouldn't. I kept going home every evening. I kept eating dinner with my wife. I kept saying goodnight. I walked Biscuit. I watched football on Sundays. I was the same person I had always been, and it was the hardest performance of my life. The moment I hadn't planned for came on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after I'd first sat in Dave's office. I was in the garage reorganizing some shelves, the kind of mindless physical task I'd been doing a lot of to manage the anxiety, when Carolyn came out and said she needed to talk to me. She sat down on the steps leading into the house. She looked like she hadn't slept. "I've done something terrible," she said. I set down what I was holding. I turned around. I waited. She told me. Not everything. Not at first. She started with Griffin. That part was almost a relief to hear out loud after all those weeks of knowing it and not saying it. She said it had started 6 months earlier. She said it was already over, that she had ended it, that she was sorry in a way she didn't have words for. She was crying before she finished the first sentence. I stood there and I listened and I did not say anything. Then she took a breath and she told me the rest. She said Griffin had told her early on that he was being targeted unfairly by a compliance investigation at his firm. He'd said it was politically motivated, that a rival executive was trying to push him out. He'd been convincing. He'd been very convincing. This was, after all, a man whose entire professional skill was convincing people of things. He told her that certain documents existed that could prove his innocence. He'd asked her to help him access them. He'd said it was just internal documents, nothing external, nothing that would hurt anyone. She'd believed him. She had used my credentials because she'd seen me log in enough times to know the password by sight, and because she thought that if anything came of it, my access level would make it look like an authorized pull rather than a breach. She hadn't thought beyond that. She hadn't let herself think beyond that. "I didn't know what was in those files," she said. "I didn't know any of this was what it was. I thought I was helping someone I trusted. I thought—" She stopped. "You thought what?" I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "I thought I was doing something small," she said. "I didn't know it was fraud. I didn't know any of it." I looked at my wife sitting on those garage steps with her face a mess and her hands shaking, and I thought about Patricia Ellison's question. Do you want to save your marriage, or do you want to know the truth? I had wanted the truth, and now I had it, and it was complicated in a way I hadn't quite prepared for, because the woman sitting in front of me wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was someone who had betrayed me in 2 separate and devastating ways, and one of those betrayals had almost made her complicit in a federal crime. And she hadn't understood what she was doing, and I didn't know how to hold all of that at the same time. I told her to go inside. I told her I needed an hour. I sat in the garage alone for a long time. Then I called Nathan. "She came to you," Nathan said. "Yeah. She didn't wait to get caught. She came to you." "I know. That matters," he said. "I'm not saying it fixes anything. I'm saying it matters." I called Patricia next. I told her what Carolyn had told me. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, here's what needs to happen." What happened next was not fast, and it was not easy, and it was not the kind of resolution that fits neatly into a story. Griffin Cole became the subject of a federal investigation. The evidence that had been transferred out of our systems was ultimately used, but not in the way he'd intended. It became part of the case against him. He was indicted 8 months later on 3 counts of securities fraud and 2 counts related to the data breach. The last I heard, he had taken a plea deal and was looking at a minimum of 4 years. Carolyn cooperated fully with federal investigators. Her lawyer, whom we paid for because, despite everything, I was not willing to watch her navigate that alone, negotiated her position carefully. Because she had come forward voluntarily, because she had not profited from any of it, and because her involvement had been limited and non-technical, she was not charged. She was not entirely without consequence. Her firm terminated her immediately, and her professional reputation in Austin's corporate communications world was effectively finished. She spent a year rebuilding from scratch. As for us, that part I won't pretend resolved cleanly, because it didn't. We tried. We spent 8 months in counseling with a therapist who was remarkably patient with 2 people who were both trying and both failing in different ways on different weeks. There were nights when I looked at her and felt something close to what I used to feel. There were nights when I looked at her and couldn't get past the image of her at that restaurant, laughing, her hand on the table. In the end, we separated. It wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter, it was just honest. We were 2 people who had been through too much together in too short a time, and the foundation of trust that a marriage needs to stand on had cracked in too many places for either of us to feel safe standing on it anymore. She moved to Portland to be closer to her sister. We still talk occasionally. Biscuit stayed with me, which I think was the only logistical decision we made without any difficulty at all. I've thought a lot about what I learned from all of it, not lessons in the inspirational poster sense, just things I understand now that I didn't before. I understand that people can love you and still make choices that hurt you in ways they don't fully see coming. I understand that betrayal rarely looks the way you imagine it will. It's almost never purely malicious, and that makes it harder to process, not easier. I understand that trust, once it becomes a question, never stops being one. And I understand that knowing the truth, even when the truth is painful, is always better than the version of your life where you chose not to look. I'm doing fine now. I'm still in Austin. I still work in fintech, different company. I run on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and I go to my brother's for dinner most Sundays. Biscuit is 9 years old and going gray around the muzzle, and I am unreasonably attached to him. It's a quieter life than I planned at 35. But it's mine, and I know exactly what's in it. If you're sitting somewhere right now with a feeling in your gut that something isn't right, I'm not telling you to blow up your life. I'm not telling you what to do at all. I'm just telling you that the truth, whatever it is something you can survive. I know because I did, and sometimes surviving it is enough.